There is a saying in the old parishes of Louisiana: the bayou keeps no secrets, it only swallows them whole. Along the winding, cypress-choked banks of the Tech, the ruins of Bowfort Hall stand as a testament to this truth. Before the fire, before the whispers turned to legend, the plantation was a jewel of St. Martin Parish, ruled by Arthur Bowfort, a man whose piety was as famous as his wife's cold, unsettling beauty. But the cane fields and sugar profits were not what the parish whispered about over glasses of brandy. They whispered about Eliza Bowfort and the 7 men. 7 enslaved men, housed not in the common quarters but in a private, high-walled dependency near the main house, one for every day of the week. The rumors were dark, laced with envy and condemnation. They painted Eliza as a modern Jezebel, a woman of unnatural appetites who kept a collection of men while her husband, Arthur, turned a blind eye, lost in his prayers and ledgers. They said a bell would ring at dusk, a single, clear tone floating over the humid air sound cue, a single, clear bell toll echoing slightly, and one of the 7 would be summoned to the great house. But the truth, as it so often does in the shadowed corners of history, was far more complex and infinitely more terrifying. The secret did not belong to the lady of the house. It belonged to the master. And the bell did not signal an act of passion. It signaled the beginning of a procedure. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Arthur Bowfort was a man sculpted from Louisiana clay and rigid Presbyterian doctrine. To the parish, he was the pillar of their community. His figure was imposing, his face handsome in a severe, unsmiling way, and his wealth was undeniable. The Bowfort sugar was the purest, his land the most productive. He hosted dinners where the talk was of scripture and commerce, never of scandal. But inside Bowfort Hall the air was different. It was stagnant, oppressive, with a silence that Arthur himself cultivated. His study was his sanctuary, a room of dark mahogany smelling of old leather and unlit cigars. Here he was not the pious community leader. He was the custodian of a crumbling legacy. For hours he would sit, not reading his Bible but staring at a single, leather-bound ledger. It was not a record of accounts. It was a genealogical chart, a meticulous, branching tree of Bowfort blood. Beside many names, his father's, his grandfather's, his great-uncle's, there were small, cryptic annotations written in red ink. Words like melancholia, the agitation, episode, loss of reason. Arthur Beaufort's darkest secret was not one of sin, but of inheritance. He was the last of his line, and he believed with the certainty of a zealot that the Bowfort blood was tainted with a creeping, hereditary madness. He lived in mortal terror, not of God but of his own mind, and of the day the red ink words would apply to him. His obsession was not with profit but with purification. He had to have an heir, but it could not be one born of his own, tainted seed. He needed to graft a new, strong branch onto his dying family tree. This obsession had hollowed him out, leaving only the cold architecture of a monstrous plan. Eliza Bowfort was a prisoner of her own beauty. She had been brought from Charleston, a celebrated belle, married to Arthur in a match that was the envy of 2 states. But the woman who now glided through the halls of Bowfort Hall was a pale imitation of that vibrant girl. She was a porcelain doll, exquisite, cold, and entirely silent. The house servants, themselves bound by Arthur's oppressive rules, watched her with a mixture of fear and pity. They saw her perfect posture, the flawless arrangement of her dark hair, the way she never spoke above a whisper. They also saw the tremor in her hands when her husband entered a room. They saw the way her eyes were always fixed on something just beyond the walls, as if plotting an escape she knew would never come. Her life was a ritual of containment. She tended no garden, hosted no teas, and managed no household affairs. Her sole, grim duty was enacted once a day. Every afternoon, just before the heat broke, she would emerge from the main house. She carried no parasol. She wore a simple gray silk dress. She would walk not toward the bustling life of the kitchens or the fields, but down a path of crushed shells to the dependency. The men's quarters. It was a squat brick building with high, narrow windows, more like a bank vault or a private asylum than a dwelling. She carried a single, ornate iron key. She would unlock the heavy door, stand in the threshold as the overseer, a pale, rodent-faced man named Huxley, called a name. Then she would lock the door and walk away, her face as impassive as stone. The parish saw this and whispered of a gluttonous empress. The servants saw it and whispered of a GH. Honest. Inside the dependency, the air was thick with dread. The 7 men who lived there were trapped in a surreal, gilded cage. Unlike the field quarters, this building was clean, the food was plentiful, the bunks were soft. They were not worked. They were preserved. They were 7 men, chosen and purchased by Arthur Beaufort's agent, Dr. Veen, over a period of 2 years. They were not chosen for their skill with cotton or cane. They were chosen for their attributes like prized livestock. There was Eliza Tuesday, who was rumored to be the son of an African prince, tall and impossibly strong. There was Friday, a man from the north, captured free, who could read and write. There was Sunday, a young man of mixed heritage with striking green eyes. And there was Marcus Thursday. Marcus was the watcher. He had been a blacksmith, and his mind was as strong as his body. He observed the routine, the hollow horror of their existence. They were kept healthy, exercised by Huxley in the small, walled yard, and forbidden from speaking to any other soul on the plantation. They were specimens. The dread climaxed with the ringing of the afternoon bell. When Eliza Bowfort appeared at the door, a silhouette of gray silk against the blinding light, the men would freeze. It was not desire they felt. It was terror. They knew the man whose name was called would be taken by Huxley, not to the main house, not to the ladies' bedchamber, but to the small, windowless clinic that stood behind their quarters. Some men returned hours later, pale, sick, and trembling. One man, the original Wednesday, had never returned at all. A new house servant, a young girl named Ammon, provided the first glimpse behind the curtain. She was small, quick, and overlooked, which made her the perfect witness. She had been assigned to serve Eliza, a task that consisted mostly of sitting in silence outside her locked bedroom door. From this vantage point, Ammon saw the plantation's true mechanics. She saw Dr. Veen arrive every afternoon, a man who smelled of calomel and sweet brandy, carrying a black leather medical bag. He would meet not with Eliza but with Arthur in the study. Ammon, pressing her ear to the thick wood, heard fragments of their conversations. The words were cold, clinical. The vessel remains unreceptive. The last specimen was incompatible. We must increase the dosage, Mr. Bowfort. The procedure is sound, but the subject's constitution is fighting it. Arthur's replies were always the same, a low, venomous hiss. Do it. Proceed. I will have my air. Ammon watched as the bell rang. She saw Huxley fetch Monday from the dependency. She saw Eliza, her face as white as her knuckles, forced to walk beside him. Arthur followed like a priest attending a sacrifice. They didn't go to the main house. They all entered the clinic. Ammon watched the clinic door for over an hour. When they emerged, Eliza was leaning on Arthur's arm, her body rigid, stumbling as if drugged. Monday was carried, unconscious, by Huxley back to the dependency. Whatever was happening in that windowless room, it was not an act of lust. It was an act of violation, clinical and cold, orchestrated by the master of the house. The clinic was Arthur Beaufort's true temple. It was a single room, built of stone to keep the heat out, and its interior was a nightmare of 19th-century medical science. A heavy, leather-strapped examination table dominated the center. A glass cabinet held rows of vials, syringes, speculums, and gleaming steel instruments. A desk in the corner held a second ledger, far more detailed than the one in Arthur's study. This was Dr. Veen's domain. Veen was not a simple country doctor. He had studied in Edinburgh and Paris, where he had become obsessed with the burgeoning dark sciences of eugenics and blood purity. In Arthur Beaufort, he had found the perfect patron, a man with unlimited funds and a desperate, unethical goal. The secret was this: Arthur was sterile. An illness in his youth had left him incapable of fathering a child. His terror of the Bowfort madness was compounded by the personal shame of his impotence. He would not let his name die, and he would not adopt. The heir had to be a Bowfort. His solution was monstrous. He would create an heir using his wife as a vessel, and the 7 as the ingredients. The men were not lovers. They were unwilling donors, bled and harvested for their vital fluids. Dr. Veen would then perform his procedure, a crude, agonizing attempt at artificial insemination on a restrained and often drugged Eliza. The 7 were chosen for their genetic traits, strength, intelligence, appearance, which Arthur hoped would cleanse his bloodline while producing a child he could pass off as his own. The project was failing. This failure amplified the horror within Bowfort Hall, turning Arthur's obsession into a quiet rage. The man known as Monday, a strong cane worker from another parish, was the latest victim of this failure. After being taken to the clinic, he was returned to the dependency in a state of delirium. Dr. Veen's methods were not just invasive, they were septic. The unsterilized instruments, the crude mixtures, the repeated bleeding, it was a recipe for infection. Monday developed a raging fever. Marcus and the others tried to care for him, applying cool rags, but they were powerless. Huxley refused to summon the doctor, noting in his own logbook only that stock one shows weakness. Monday died 3 days later, his body convulsing in the dark. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the swamp, and the official record signed by Dr. Veen listed swamp fever as the cause. His bunk in the dependency remained empty for only a day. A new man, purchased at auction in New Orleans, arrived on Thursday. He was assigned the name Monday. The system was replaceable. This event shifted the atmosphere in the dependency from dread to a cold, simmering fury. Marcus, watching the new Monday look around in confusion, knew this was not a prison they could wait out. It was an abattoir. They were being consumed, one, by the master's secret. The strain of the secret began to wear on the public facade. Arthur, always severe, became visibly cruel. He, who had never raised his voice, was now heard shouting at his overseers. He ordered a public whipping of a field hand for a minor infraction, a display of dominance that seemed compensatory, a desperate assertion of the masculinity he felt he lacked. The parish noticed. They mistook his rage for stress over the failing sugar prices, but the servants knew better. They saw the way he looked at his wife. Eliza, in turn, retreated further. She was now a ghost in her own home. Amity, the house girl, would find her standing motionless in front of the grand hallway mirror, her reflection staring back, hollow-eyed. Eliza seemed to be studying her own face as if it belonged to a stranger. One evening, Amity saw her press her forehead against the cool glass, her shoulders shaking in a silent, racking sob. But the moment she heard Amity's soft footstep, the mask snapped back into place. She turned, her face serene and cold. "The silver needs polishing," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "See to it." The mirrors in Bowfort Hall became a recurring symbol of this imprisonment. For Eliza, they reflected the stranger she had become, a vessel for a monstrous experiment. For Arthur, they were a torment, reflecting the failure of his body and the potential madness he saw lurking in his own eyes. He began to have them covered. Inside the dependency, Marcus was not idle. He was a blacksmith, and his mind worked like one, assessing strengths, finding weaknesses, and waiting for the right moment to apply pressure. He had been studying the dependency, the routines of Huxley, the way the light fell in the yard. He had also been studying the other men. He spoke quietly with Eliza Tuesday and Friday, the man who could read. Friday had seen scraps of newspaper used to wrap supplies. He knew the year, the state of the country. He knew that north of the Ohio River a man could be free, but the dependency was a fortress. The walls were smooth brick, the windows too high, the door solid oak. Escape seemed impossible, but Marcus wasn't just thinking of escape. He was thinking of dismantling the entire operation. He needed information, and he needed a weapon. He found the latter in the yard, a loose stone at the base of the wall. Over weeks, working at night, he dug at it, finally prying it free. Behind it, in the damp earth, he began to fashion a crude tool, a shank sharpened against the stone, its handle wrapped in cloth torn from his mattress. He wasn't sure when he would use it, but the weight of it in his hand was the first semblance of power he had felt since his capture. He knew, with a blacksmith's certainty, that a system so tautly wound was brittle. It only needed to be struck in the right place. Amity, driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate, youthful curiosity, began her own investigation. She was terrified of Arthur, but she felt a strange, protective pity for her mistress, Eliza. She started to take risks. When cleaning Arthur's study, a room she was usually forbidden from, she let her eyes linger. She saw the genealogical ledger, the red ink. But she also saw another, smaller book, hidden beneath a stack of financial reports. It was Dr. Veen's private journal. She didn't dare open it, but one day as she dusted, the book fell and a loose page fluttered out. Amity, her heart pounding, snatched it. She couldn't read, but she recognized the symbols. It was a list of names. Monday, Jethro expired. Tuesday, Elias resistant. Wednesday, Samuel expired. Thursday, Marcus prime. Friday, James literate. Saturday, Nero weak. Sunday, Ammon compatible. Below the list was a crude draw. Wing of a medical instrument and notes about fluidic viability and uterine response. Amity, though she didn't understand the words, understood the cold, terrifying calculus. The men were being catalogued. Some had expired. Her blood ran cold. She slipped the page into her pocket. She had to show someone. She had to find a way to warn them. She thought of the man named Friday, the one the overseer had mocked for being able to read. Eliza's passivity was a lie. It was the forced stillness of a trapped animal, watching for the one moment the cage door is left unlatched. Her hatred for her husband was a cold, pure thing far deeper than the bayou. He had not just imprisoned her. He had systematically violated her body and soul, using medicine as his weapon. She, too, had a plan. It was subtle, born of her total powerlessness. She began to sabotage the procedures in the only ways she could. She would feign illness, a female complaint, forcing Dr. Veen to postpone. She would accidentally drop a tray of his prepared vials, shattering them. She began to bribe Amity not with money but with small kindnesses and shared glances of female conspiracy. She gave Amity a small locket. "This was my mother's," she whispered. "Keep it safe. Keep yourself safe." It was a warning, but her greatest act of rebellion was with her own body. Dr. Veen had prescribed her a tonic of laudanum and iron, meant to calm her nerves and strengthen her constitution for the procedures. Eliza never swallowed it. Every night she would hold the bitter liquid in her mouth until the nurse left, and then spit it into her porcelain wash basin. She was keeping her mind clear. She was waiting. She knew Arthur's obsession would eventually be his ruin, and she intended to be there to see it. The opportunity for Amity to act came during a rare moment of distraction. Arthur and Huxley had ridden to the far side of the estate to deal with a fire in the sugar mill. A fire, though Amity didn't know it, that had been deliberately set by a field hand who hated Huxley. The plantation was in a state of controlled chaos. Amity, clutching the doctor's page, ran from the main house, not to the dependency, but to the small garden plot where the house servants were allowed to grow their own vegetables. She knew Friday was sometimes brought there under guard to tend the herbs for the doctor's medicines. She found him, pulling weeds, Huxley's deputy watching him with a rifle. Amity, pretending to stumble, accidentally dropped a bundle of gathered okra near him. As she bent to retrieve it, she slipped him the folded page. "Read this," she whispered, her voice trembling. He calls you specimens." Friday, James palmed the note without looking up, his face a mask. He nodded once. The deputy shouted at Amity to get back to the house. As she ran, she glanced back. She saw James straighten up, wiping his brow, and in that brief moment, he unfolded the paper in his hand. She saw his entire body go rigid. She had just armed them with the truth. The note changed everything. That night in the dark, hushed confines of the dependency, James read the words aloud to the other 5 men. The air crackled with a new, terrible understanding. Expired. Specimen, resistant, compatible. The euphemisms of the auction block were gone, replaced by the cold language of a laboratory. They were not just slaves, they were raw materials in Arthur Beaufort's mad experiment. The rumor of Eliza's appetite was a lie to cover her husband's. The men reacted in different ways. Elias, Tuesday, wept with rage. Sunday, the young, green-eyed man seemed to crumble, his hope extinguished. But Marcus, holding his sharpened shank, felt a cold calm settle over him. "He is killing us," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. "He is trying to breed us, and when we fail, we expire." Monday and Wednesday weren't the first. They are just the first we've seen. James, the reader, looked at him. The note says you are prime, Marcus. And Sunday is compatible. They will be coming for you next, probably both of you. The men looked at Sunday, Ammon, who was trembling, then they looked at Marcus. The hierarchy of the cage was gone. They were 6 men united by a single, desperate imperative, survival. He thinks he's a god, Marcus said, testing the point of his shank. It's time we showed him he's just a man. It was Sunday, Ammon, who was summoned next. The bell rang the following afternoon. Ammon, pale and shaking, was taken by Huxley to the clinic. Arthur, Eliza, and Dr. Veen were waiting. The procedure began, but this time something was different. Ammon, armed with the knowledge from the note, was not a passive victim. He was a terrified man who knew he was being violated. As Dr. Veen prepared his instruments, Ammon, in a burst of desperate strength, broke one of his restraints and grabbed a glass vial from the tray. He held it to his own throat. "Stay away," he screamed, his green eyes wild with terror. "Stay away from me." Dr. Veen froze. Arthur, enraged by this defiance, stepped forward. "Insolent, Huxley, restrain him." But Eliza suddenly stood up, knocking her chair over. "No," she screamed, her voice, so long unused, cracking through the sterile room. "Arthur, look at him. He's just a boy. This is madness." The sudden, dual defiance shocked Arthur into silence. In that moment of hesitation, Ammon, seeing no escape, drew the broken vial across his own arm, a deep, arterial cut. Blood sprayed across the white floor. It was an act of ultimate resistance, a choice to die by his own hand rather than be a part of the experiment. The room descended into chaos. Ammon's desperate act shattered the sterile routine. He did not die. Huxley and Dr. Veen managed to staunch the bleeding, but the procedure was a failure. The compatible specimen was now damaged, useless to Arthur. Ammon was thrown back into the dependency, his arm crudely stitched, delirious with fever and blood loss, a living testament to the horror they faced. For Arthur, this was the final straw. His experiment, his meticulous plan, was failing. The stock was rebellious. His wife was defiant. The madness he so feared felt closer than ever, its whispers telling him he was losing control. His piety fractured, revealing the monster beneath. He stormed into Eliza's bedroom, Amity cowering in the hall. He tore the locket from her neck. "You did this," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Your weakness, your defiance, you've infected them with it." He struck her, a single, brutal blow that sent her crashing into her vanity, shattering the mirror. Sound cue, a sharp crack and the tinkle of falling glass. "You are a vessel," he spat at her bleeding reflection. "Nothing more. If you will not be sanctified, you will be forced." He locked her in her room, posting Huxley's deputy outside the door. He then marched to his study and made a new entry in his ledger. The time for subtlety was over. He would proceed with the prime specimen, Marcus, and he would ensure there was no resistance. The shattered mirror became the catalyst. Eliza, locked in her room, staring at her own fragmented reflection, was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. The strike had broken Arthur's final hold on her. Her fear was burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. She had one ally, Amity. The girl, loyal and terrified, was still allowed in to bring food and water. As Amity tended the cut on Eliza's face, Eliza gripped her arm. "You are brave, Amity," she whispered, her voice urgent. "I need your help, not for me, for them, for all of us." She explained her plan. It was simple and desperate. Arthur kept the master keys to the plantation, to the dependency, the clinic, the gun cabinet on a ring in his study, hidden in a locked desk drawer. Arthur was now spending every night in his study, drinking heavily, agonizing over his ledger. Eliza knew he would fall into a drunken sleep. Amity was small enough to slip in, take the key, and get it to Marcus. "Tell him. Tell him to burn the ledger," Eliza whispered. "The one in the study, the one with the red ink. It is his real master. Tell him to burn it and burn this whole house down with it. It is the only way." Amity, clutching the locket Eliza had given her, looked at the locked door, at her bleeding mistress, and nodded. That night Amity became a ghost. She waited hours, her back pressed against the hallway wall, until the sounds from Arthur's study changed from pacing and muttered curses to the deep, rhythmic snores of a drunken stupor. The house was dead quiet, the air thick and hot. She slipped the lock on the study door, a skill she had learned as a child, and entered the room. It smelled of spilled brandy and madness. Arthur was slumped over his desk, his face buried in his arms, the genealogical ledger open before him. The red ink seemed to glow in the moonlight. Amity's hands trembled so violently she could barely function. She found the small key to the desk drawer tucked inside Arthur's waistcoat. She eased the drawer open. There, glinting on velvet, was the master ring. She took it. She didn't just take the key to the dependency. She took them all. She relocked the drawer, slipped the key back into his waistcoat, and backed out of the room, a phantom carrying the keys to the entire kingdom. She ran barefoot and silent out of the great house, past the clinic, to the high brick wall of the men's quarters. She couldn't get inside, but she knew Marcus was waiting. She threw the heavy iron ring over the wall. It landed with a soft thud in the dirt yard. Sound cue, the soft, heavy thud of the keys. Inside the dependency, Marcus had been waiting by the wall, summoned by a low whistle Amity had practiced. He heard the thud and scrambled for the keys. His fingers closed around the cold iron. It was a shock, a sudden, impossible surge of power. He now held the keys to his owl. And Cage. He woke James Friday and Eliza Tuesday. The other two men, Saturday and New Monday, were too broken by fear to be of use. Ammon, Sunday, was still feverish from his wound. "It's time," Marcus whispered. He unlocked the heavy door. The click of the bolt sliding back was the loudest sound in the world. For a moment, the three men just stood in the open doorway, breathing the free, humid night air. The temptation to simply run, to vanish into the bayou, was overwhelming. But James put a hand on Marcus's arm. "The girl, Amity, and the lady, we can't leave them." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "And the ledger," the lady said, "burn the ledger." He looked at the main house, a dark monolith against the stars, and then at the clinic. "Elias, you get Ammon, take him and the others, get to the swamp, follow the water north. James, you come with me, we finish this." He was no longer Thursday. He was Marcus, the blacksmith, and he was ready to bring the hammer down. The plan split. Elias, half carrying the feverish Ammon, roused the other two men. With a quiet, terrified urgency, he led them out of the dependency and toward the dark line of cypress trees that marked the edge of the swamp. They were the first to taste freedom. Marcus and James moved toward the main house, but as they passed the clinic, James paused. "In here, Marcus, the other book, the doctor's book, it has the names of the dead. Monday, Wednesday, it's the only proof." Marcus nodded. Using the keys, he opened the clinic. The room was dark, smelling of ether and Ammon's dried blood. James, who knew the doctor's habits, went straight to the desk. He found the medical ledger. As he tucked it into his shirt, his hand brushed against a tray of instruments. He stopped. He picked up a heavy steel surgical saw, its teeth fine and sharp. He looked at Marcus. "For Huxley," he said, his voice flat. Marcus took a heavy-handled surgical clamp, its weight familiar in his blacksmith's hand. They were no longer unarmed. They left the clinic, locking the door behind them, and moved like shadows toward the main house, where the master slept on his throne of lies. Amity, having delivered the keys, had returned to her post outside Eliza's locked door. She was huddled on the floor when she heard the softest click of the lock. The door opened. It wasn't Arthur. It was Marcus, breathing hard, the massive key ring in his hand. Behind him stood James, holding the doctor's ledger. Amity stared, her eyes wide. Eliza rose from her chair, her face illuminated by the moonlight from the window. She and Marcus looked at each other for a long, silent moment. The enslaved man and the imprisoned lady united by their shared enemy. "The ledger," Eliza whispered. "In the study, he's asleep." "We know," Marcus said. "You and the girl go, get to the swamp. Elias is waiting." "No," Eliza said. Her voice was cold, final. "I'm not running, I'm finishing this." She walked past him, out of her room for the first time as a free woman, and moved toward the study. "James," Marcus ordered, "take Amity. Go, now. Get the ledger and the girl to freedom." James hesitated, looking at the ledger, then at Eliza's determined back. He grabbed Amity's hand. "This way," he hissed, pulling her toward the servants' stairs. "But the lady," Amity whispered. "She has her own ghosts to bury," James said, pulling her into the darkness. Marcus followed Eliza to the study. The door was ajar. Arthur was still slumped at the desk, the room reeking of brandy. The genealogical ledger lay open. Eliza stood over her husband, her shadow falling across the list of names. For a moment Marcus thought she would kill him in his sleep. She picked up a heavy glass inkwell, her hand raised, but she stopped. "It's too fast," she whispered. She looked at the ledger. "This is his heart. This is what he loves." She picked up the oil lamp from the mantel. Marcus understood. He moved to the shelves, pulling down the curtains, tossing stacks of financial records onto the floor, piling them around the desk. He worked quickly, silently. Eliza watched him, her expression unreadable. She then went to the desk and began to rip pages from the precious ledger, her movements methodical, calm. She tore out the pages with the red ink, the records of the Bowfort madness, and crumpled them. "He needs to see it," she said. She looked at Marcus. "Get out. Go." "Not without you," Marcus said. Just as he spoke, a floorboard creaked in the hall. Huxley, the pale overseer, stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. "The bell didn't ring," he whispered, his rodent eyes wide, taking in the scene. Huxley had been drawn by the unlocked dependency door. He had found it empty and in a panic ran to the main house, his first instinct to protect his master. The pistol was aimed at Marcus. "Filth," Huxley hissed. "You'll hang for this." But as he raised the gun, Eliza moved. She threw the heavy glass inkwell. It missed Huxley but shot. He turned the lamp he was carrying in his other hand. Oil and glass sprayed across the hallway floor. Huxley, startled, fired the pistol. The shot went wide, burying itself in the doorframe, the sound exploding through the silent house. Sound cue, a single, deafening pistol shot echoing. The sound woke Arthur. He bolted upright, his eyes wild, disoriented. He saw Marcus. He saw Eliza holding the lamp. He saw the torn pages of his ledger. "No," he roared, a sound of pure, animalistic agony. "My book, what have you done?" He lunged, not at Marcus, but at Eliza, his hands reaching for the pages she held. Huxley, recovering, raised his pistol again, this time aiming at Eliza. "No witnesses," he muttered, but Marcus was faster. He crossed the room in 2 bounds, bringing the heavy surgical clamp down on Huxley's wrist. The sound of bone snapping was sharp and wet. The gun clattered to the floor. The study was a tinderbox of paper, spilled oil, and brandy. As Arthur scrambled for his torn ledger pages, he knocked the lamp from Eliza's hand. It fell, not onto the rug, but into the pool of oil in the hallway. The result was instantaneous. A whoosh of blue and orange flame erupted, climbing the walls, consuming the dry wood of the doorframe. The fire was alive. Arthur, screaming, was suddenly trapped on the far side of the desk, a wall of flame sealing him in with his precious, burning legacy. He grabbed the heavy ledger, clutching it to his chest as the edges smoldered. "Madness!" he shrieked, his eyes rolling. "It's in the blood!" He was staring at the flames, but seeing his ancestors. The Bowfort madness, the thing he had sacrificed everything to escape, had finally claimed him. Huxley, clutching his broken arm, was scrambling away from the fire, but Marcus blocked his path. "Where are the others?" Marcus demanded, his voice a low growl, the clamp raised. "Monday, Wednesday, where are their graves?" Huxley, his face pale with pain and terror, just shook his head. The swamp, like the others." Marcus hit him once, and the overseer crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The roar of the fire was becoming deafening. "We have to go now." Marcus grabbed Eliza's arm. The hallway was an inferno. The main staircase was already catching. Smoke was so thick it was hard to breathe. Eliza, however, seemed to be in a trance. She was watching her husband. Arthur was no longer screaming. He was sitting in his chair, surrounded by a ring of fire, rocking back and forth, stroking the smoldering cover of his ledger, whispering to it. "Purified," he muttered. "The blood is clean, clean." He was smiling, his face lit by the orange glow. He had finally succumbed to the very thing he feared. "Eliza!" Marcus shouted, pulling her. The word snapped her back. She looked one last time at the man in the chair, a living ghost being consumed by his own obsession. Then she turned and ran with Marcus, not toward the front of the house, but toward the servants' stairs, the only path not yet blocked by the conflagration. The smoke followed them, a hot, acrid fog that smelled of burning history and righteous judgment. Bowfort Hall, built on a foundation of secrets and blood, was purifying itself. They burst out of the servants' entrance into the night air, choking, their eyes streaming. The entire front of the house was now engulfed. Flames licked at the columns, reaching for the roof. Sound cue, a deep roaring fire with the crash of timbers. Field hands were running from the quarters, shouting, forming a useless bucket brigade. No one even noticed Eliza and Marcus as they slipped around the side of the house, melting into the chaos. They ran past the dependency, its door still swinging open. They ran past the clinic, a dark, silent stone. They ran toward the bayou, toward the cypress line where the others were waiting. As Eliza reached the tree line, she stopped and looked back. The roof of Bowfort Hall collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks into the Louisiana sky. The home that had been her prison was gone. The man who had been her tormentor was gone. The secret was gone, consumed by the fire. She touched the bleeding cut on her face, the last mark he would ever leave on her. Then she turned her back on the ashes and disappeared with Marcus into the swamp. The fire at Bowfort Hall burned for 2 days. The main house was reduced to a pile of scorched bricks and blackened chimneys. The clinic and the dependency, being built of stone and brick, mostly survived, but the fire had been so hot it had cracked their walls and burned away their roofs. When the parish authorities finally arrived to investigate, they found 2 bodies in the ruins of the study. One, identified as Arthur Bowfort, was found in his chair, his arms wrapped around the charred, unrecognizable remains of a large book. The other, found near the doorway, was identified as the overseer, Huxley, his skull crushed by a heavy, unidentified object. The sheriff, a friend of Arthur's, declared it a tragic accident. He ruled that Mr. Bowfort and his overseer, likely drunk on brandy, had knocked over a lamp while reviewing accounts. The fire had spread, trapping them both. It was a neat, clean story that satisfied the parish. It allowed them to mourn the pious Mr. Bowfort and condemn the carelessness that led to his demise. Of the lady, Eliza, there was no sign. It was assumed, with grim nods, that she too had been consumed by the inferno. Her delicate body turned to ash, leaving no trace. But the servants knew better. In the days that followed, as the plantation's assets were seized by Arthur's distant cousins, the enslaved community whispered the true story. They knew the lady had not died. They knew the 7 were gone. The whispers changed. The tale of the lascivious Lady of the Week died, replaced by a new, more potent legend. They said the 7 men, led by the blacksmith Marcus, had risen up. They said they had confronted the master, executed the overseer, and burned the house of their torment to the ground. And they said the lady Eliza, driven mad by her husband's cruelty, had helped them. That she had fled into the bayou with them, choosing a life of freedom in the swamps over her gilded cage. Ammon, who had escaped with James, was the source of this story. She and James had found Eliza and the others, and together they followed the waterways north, carrying the doctor's ledger as their proof and their testament. The story of the Bowfort Uprising, as it came to be known, became a secret history, a tale of hope and violent retribution passed down in whispers for generations. The official story, however, had to account for the disappearance of the 7 men. The new owners, distant cousins from Charleston, conducted a brief, disinterested inventory. They found the dependency empty, the men listed in the slave ledger simply gone. The sheriff, in his final report, concluded that the 7 men, seeing the chaos of the fire, had seized the opportunity to escape. A regrettable loss of property, he called it. Patrols were sent out, but the Louisiana swamp is a world unto itself. It does not give up those who seek its sanctuary. The 7, or rather the 6 survivors, were never found. Their names, Marcus, James, Eliza, Ammon, and the 2 others, were simply written off as a financial loss. The parish, eager to forget the unsettling business of Bowfort Hall, accepted this. It was easier to believe in opportunistic escape than in a conspiracy of madness, medicine, and murder. The plantation's name was changed, the land tilled, and the parish tried very hard to erase the stain. But the land remembered. The new plantation, built on the ashes of the old, never prospered. The soil, it was said, had been soured by the fire. Cane grew stunted. Slaves whispered that the grounds were haunted, not by Arthur but by the ghosts of the men who had expired in the clinic. Men like Monday and Wednesday, whose unmarked graves in the swamp seeped their anger into the water table. They said that on certain nights you could hear a single solitary bell ring sound cue, a faint, distant bell toll, but no one could ever find its source. The new owners, plagued by misfortune and the feeling of being constantly watched, abandoned the property within a decade. Bowfort Hall became a ruin, a place locals avoided, especially after dark. The story of the Seven was reclaimed by the swamp, becoming a campfire tale to frighten children, the dark historical truth smoothed over by the polish of folklore. And what of the survivors? The doctor's ledger, carried by James, eventually made its way to abolitionist circles in Philadelphia. It was a bombshell, though it didn't name Arthur Bowfort explicitly, using codes instead. It provided a chilling, clinical account of eugenic experiments being performed on enslaved people. It was copied, circulated in private, and became one of many horrific documents used to fuel the fire of the abolitionist movement. It served as proof that slavery was not just an economic evil, but a moral and medical one, where human beings were reduced to specimens and stock. The names Monday Jethro and Wednesday Samuel were read aloud in secret meetings, their deaths no longer unrecorded but transformed into martyrdom. The ledger gave a voice to the men Arthur had tried to erase, ensuring their expiration was not an ending, but the beginning of a larger story. Eliza Bowfort, Marcus, James, Amity, and the others navigated the treacherous network of the swamp, aided by maroon communities and the secret paths of the Underground Railroad. They did not all survive the journey. Ammon, Sunday, weakened by his wound and the fever, died before they reached the Ohio River. He was buried as a free man, a small cross of twigs marking his grave. The others scattered. James and Amity, carrying the ledger, made it to Philadelphia. Eliza, Tuesday, New Monday, found passage on a ship to Canada. But Marcus and Eliza, their story is the one that faded most completely from the official record, yet lingered most persistently in legend. Some said they parted ways, Eliza using her aristocratic bearing to blend into Northern society, Marcus finding work as a blacksmith under a new name. But the more romantic, more whispered tale was that they never parted. That the blacksmith and the lady, bound by the trauma and the fire, crossed the river together and built a new life, their shared secret a bond no one else could ever understand. Their descendants, it was said, knew nothing of the Bowfort madness, only of the courage of their ancestors. Years later, after the Civil War, a Freedmen's Bureau agent visited the ruins of Bowfort Hall. He was cataloging properties and interviewing the newly freed people in the parish. He heard the stories, the whispers of the Seven, the fire, the mad master. He was a practical man, but the place unnerved him. He explored the crumbling stone shell of the clinic. There, in the dirt and rubble, he found a small, corroded object. It was a steel surgical clamp, heavy and oddly balanced. Nearby, he found a collection of shattered, violet-colored glass vials. He also found, half buried near the wall of the dependency, a small, crudely carved wooden bird. He logged the items as medical artifacts and folk art, having no concept of their true, terrible significance. He couldn't know he held the weapon Marcus had used, the vials from Dr. Veen's experiments, and a small, hopeful object carved by Friday for Amity. The evidence was all there, but the context was burned away, leaving only silent, ambiguous relics. The title of this story, "The Plantation Lady Had a Male Slave for Every Day of the Week," survived, but its meaning was inverted. It became a cautionary tale told by mothers to their daughters in the parish, a warning against female desire and the dangers of straying from piety. The true story, the one of Arthur's madness, his sterility, and his monstrous eugenic obsession, was too terrible to be believed. It was easier, more comfortable, to blame the woman. Eliza Bowfort was cemented in local legend as the villain, the Jezebel of the Tech, who, in her depravity, brought ruin upon her noble husband and his house. The secret, in the end, was kept. The patriarchy of the era, confronted with a story of its own monstrous failure, simply rewrote the narrative. They buried Arthur's secret, not in the ground, but in plain sight, hidden behind a lurid, false tale of female lust. The history of places like Bowfort Hall is written in two inks. There is the black ink of the official record, the sales, the accounts, the sheriff's reports, and the obituaries. And then there is the red ink of the blood, the madness, and the secrets. Arthur Beaufort's genealogical ledger, with its cryptic notes of agitation and loss of reason, was his own private terror, a fear that he externalized, projecting it onto his wife and the men he imprisoned. He sought to purify his bloodline by poisoning the lives of everyone around him. The true Beaufort madness was not the hereditary illness he feared. It was the obsession with bloodlines, the dehumanization of people into stock, and the belief that one man had the right to play God, using other human beings as mere instruments of his will. This was the true, pervasive madness of the entire system. Today, nothing remains of Bowfort Hall but a few crumbling brick foundations, slowly being swallowed by the cypress roots in the encroaching bayou. The land is wild, and locals still refuse to go there. They say the air is cold, even in the Louisiana summer, and that the ground is stained. The secret of Arthur Beaufort, his sterile obsession, and the dark medical horror he perpetrated in the Stone Clinic, is almost entirely gone, consumed by the fire and rewritten by comfortable lies. But the story of the seven lingers. It is a reminder that what we see on the surface, the rumors, the whispers, the simple, salacious tales, is often just a mask designed to hide a much darker, more complex, and more terrifying truth. The truth is not always buried. Sometimes it's just locked away, waiting for a key, a fire, and the courage to burn the whole house down. If you want more dark historical stories like this, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America and keep the past from being erased.